Welcome again to the Wolves and Moose of Isle Royale. We've been talking about the life history of moose. That's what we spoke about during the last lecture, and we're going to continue on with that topic today. Now yesterday, what we spoke about was mostly compensatory growth and how that is an important feature in the life history of an organism, and how Isle Royale moose teaches something about that phenomenon. Today what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about is arthritis. We're going to focus on that topic for most of today's lecture. However, before getting into that, there was a part of the last lecture that I kind of stumbled through and didn't do such a good job, and I think it was a bit confusing. It's just about a 3-minute passage or so from that lecture that I basically want to just redo right now, again, hopefully for the sake of clarity. And so here we go with that part. If you remember, one of the questions that we were asking about compensatory growth was whether females have a greater capacity for compensatory growth than the males. And I had indicated what the hypothesis is that we were testing, both graphically and in terms of what the R squared should be for the males versus the females, and that was all fine. There was no trouble there. Then I showed the results, and that was fine too. Nothing to be changed there. But then what I wanted to do that I didn't do such a good job on is explain how and why this is a bit of an unexpected result. And that's the part that I want to clarify right now. The traditional explanation for why it's thought that females would have a greater capacity for compensatory growth than males is what's written on the screen right now. It's kind of a twofold idea. First, it's thought that males grow, well, it's known that males grow larger and faster than the females. And as a result, they're unable to trade off any more energy into compensatory growth. They're putting as much as they possibly can do into it. They're always growing as fast as they can. They just can't put any more into it. Okay, well, that's the reasoning for thinking that females would have this compensatory growth where males wouldn't. Well, the data suggests that that's not maybe what's going on. So maybe what could explain this? Well, maybe for females, it is in fact better if they're bigger. And maybe they're also growing as fast a rate as they can, generally, even though they never get as big as males. And because they're growing as fast as they can, they're basically no different from the males. Another possibility that could explain why the results were a bit unexpected is that maybe males have a little bit more compensation than is kind of generally appreciated, just in terms of thinking our way through it, and that more the greater capacity for compensation may have to do with the growing of the antlers. For moose, male moose now, sometimes being big is important, but sometimes having big antlers is important, and maybe you can't have both if you have limited resources and energy. And so maybe there's an opportunity to kind of trade off between those two features, actual body size in terms of kilograms, and then the antler size. And so I think the main point is that sexual selection between males and females, by sexual selection, I mean the fact that the environment that a male moose lives in is in some important ways different than the environment of a female moose, and it's different because of their reproductive strategies, how those differ. These ideas over here on the left are kind of a traditional perspective and view on things, and maybe it's just that sexual selection is a little bit more complicated than we presume, and these ideas over here are just as important. And so I think that may be some important explanations for why that one result is unexpected. Now, the other idea that I kind of stumbled through was this business about, you kind of posed as a question, did moose that died with signs of senescence exhibit greater compensatory growth than moose dying without signs of senescence? And the reason to be motivated by this hypothesis is that if compensatory growth is costly, then it might involve some kind of a trade-off, and that trade-off might be manifest later in life, and that would be having arthritis or jaw necrosis. That part I explained just fine. But I had some troubles here with my less than and equal than signs and that sort of a thing. And so now the lines are all just fine, and really it's not that complicated of an idea. I just didn't explain it very well. Basically, if moose that died with signs of senescence had more compensatory growth, if that's what we think is going on, then the graph that we see on the screen now, and then that sentence about the R-squareds, that's what we would expect. We would expect the R-squared for senescent moose to be less than the R-squared for non-senescent moose. We find that that's the case in the sense that the number 0.18 is less than the number 0.29. Okay, so that part is maybe expected. However, if we compare these two numbers, the 0.18 and the 0.29, if we compare those two numbers in a statistical hypothesis test, then the p-value is kind of big. In fact, it's too big to claim that there's an actual difference between those values. There just seems to be no difference at all. In this sense, the result is unexpected. Basically, there's not evidence to suggest that senescent moose and non-senescent moose differ in their capacity for compensatory growth. In any event, hopefully that kind of clarifies this particular topic, and if there is still some confusions or occasion to clarify things, we can do that in one of our discussion sessions. So anyways, now we'll move on to new topics. And the new topic that I want to move on to is still within the realm of life history of moose, but now I want to really focus on arthritis. We talked about it a little bit, but we're going to now give it focused attention. First of all, I want to just show you some images that kind of describe a little bit about what we know about arthritis. In here we can just kind of go through a series of photographs that show how arthritis can develop. I've showed you pictures like this, but I want to focus a little bit on it. This upper image number A, is a healthy hip socket for a moose. And what's important to kind of focus on is this little hole and groove right here. That hole and groove is a spot where a ligament connects the head of the femur or the head of the leg bone and connects it into the pelvis. Okay, so in other words, that ligament can go through that groove, allows for the two bones to be attached, but there's still some good flexibility, so it can rotate around. The first stage in arthritis is basically, for moose anyways, when they get arthritis, is for that hole and for that groove to basically close up. It calcifies. Just bone starts to grow in there. What happens is basically it severs that ligament. And then what happens next is that the entire joint becomes basically, we say in the technical term, it becomes remodeled. Literally, bone cells are kind of wither away and the new bone cells form. And as old ones wither away and new ones form, it becomes kind of a deformed affair. And what happens in this case, if you can see a little bit, there are actually two little sections, two little grooves or recesses where the femur head can sit in, and it can basically oscillate from one to the other or get jostled from one groove to the next groove. And then eventually what happens in a very severe case like this is that there isn't even a joint anymore. That surface of the bone is so basically flat and deformed, there isn't actually a good spot for the femur head to go, and the femur head is just rolling around in there quite wildly. The moose that has this problem, is going to have a very severe limp. Isn't going to be able to get around very well. One of the things that we know is that by the time that a human needs to get a hip replacement because it's so painful to walk around with that kind of arthritis, that severity of arthritis is difficult for us to tell from this normal case unless you're kind of an expert at what to look for. In other words, the deformities in a human that cause severe pain are minuscule compared to some of these really gross deformities that we can see here. The other thing that's the case, or the other thing that we believe to be the case, is that this arthritis we think can form really quite rapidly. Basically, it comes down to this. It's very difficult to imagine that a moose can survive with arthritis that even looks like this for very long without wolves finding it and killing it. And as a result, we think that these moose may develop from perfectly normal hips to these very, very advanced stages of arthritis in about 1 year's time, maybe a bit less than a year, because basically by the time you get to the first winter when you have your arthritis, times are going to be so tough for that moose that the wolves are going to have a pretty easy time of killing it. When we correspond with people who study arthritis in things like horses and cattle and stuff like that, they confirm that, yeah, it seems pretty plausible that it could advance that rapidly. So not only can arthritis advance pretty rapidly in a moose, an individual moose, it is also a pretty common phenomenon as a moose gets older. And so this graph shows along the x-axis is age of the moose, and on the y-axis is the proportion of moose that die at those various ages and have arthritis. So among 6-year-old moose, which is still generally considered to be a prime-aged moose, about 15% or so of those moose have arthritis. By the time that we get to relatively old moose, 17-year-old moose, say, almost 100% of those moose have arthritis. That's among the males. Females is a similar story, except that females never get arthritis quite as much as the males do. There's another pattern that's similar to this one, and that has to do with osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is basically the loss of bone mass, loss of bone density in an organism. It happens, of course, to humans. In humans, it's more common in females. In moose, osteoporosis and arthritis are both more common in the males, not the females. And we think this has to do with basically the reproductive strategy of a moose, which, as you know, involves growing these antlers year after year after year. These antlers are just a bunch of calcium. It's basically, antlers are external bone growing on the outside of the animal. And basically the loss of all that calcium is liable to lead to greater incidence of not only osteoporosis, but pretty likely also these kind of troubles with bones in the hips, the arthritis. And so anyways, that's just kind of the basic background on arthritis in moose on Isle Royale. One of the things, one other point about arthritis and moose on Isle Royale is that arthritis on Isle Royale seems to be really much more prevalent than it is in other ungulate populations. When people study populations of elk or moose in other parts of the world, arthritis can be found, but it's not nearly as common as what we see on Isle Royale. We don't know why that is. However, the fact that it's at such a high incidence does make it a little bit easier for us to study why it is that some moose have it and some moose don't, because moose that don't have it, they're relatively common. Moose that have it are relatively common, and so it makes some of the statistics become a little bit easier to kind of apply and figure out what's going on. Okay, now what I want to do is step away from moose just a minute, and I want to talk about arthritis more generally as it relates to life history theory. The first thing to understand about arthritis is that it is a form of senescence, and I've used this word senescence a few times already in this lecture and in previous lectures, but now I want to focus on it and kind of basically give it a real precise definition. A synonym for senescence is aging, and it's basically a decline in some kind of body condition with increasing age. So it's a real common phenomenon. We're very, very familiar with this idea. Alfred Russel Wallace, whose picture is being shown here, is the first person to recognize that aging requires an explanation. Wallace is a figure to kind of pay attention to. If you've heard of him, you maybe already know why, but if not, just to say very, very briefly here, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace have something in common, and that is that each developed a theory of natural selection, and they both developed those theories at about the same time in the mid-1800s. They did it independently, and they both did it by traveling basically around the world and studying the variation in different organisms. They saw this diversity of life that occurs within individual organisms, and that's basically what life history theory is all about, as you know now. And from those observations, both Darwin and Wallace developed these theories of natural selection. It's quite an episode in the history of science to kind of figure out, did Darwin rather inappropriately get all of the credit, or did Wallace just kind of not do as good a job, and was he just a little bit slower in getting the word out and that sort of thing? Some interesting history going on there we won't cover here, but if you're interested in it, it's pretty easy to find on the internet if you type in these fellas' names and natural selection, that sort of thing. Anyways, to return to the main point, which is about Wallace's recognizing that aging requires an explanation. You know, some of the great advances in science just come from realizing that's a phenomenon that we just shouldn't take it for granted. It deserves an explanation. Up until Wallace, people just said aging. How else would it be? doesn't really require an explanation. It's just the way the world is. Wallace said, no, that's not the case. His idea is that there's no law of physics, there's no law in biology that suggests that senescence is necessary. As a result, it demands an explanation. Why does it happen? To kind of wrap our minds around this, we can say, well, why wouldn't you be in prime shape at the time of your death? Why shouldn't evolution work to shape organisms in that way, make their lives be like that? If so, if we were always in the prime shape at the time of our death, then the most important causes of death would be things like catastrophes and accidents. You fell off of a cliff, or a big hurricane came by and just destroyed a bunch of individuals in the path of the hurricane, or whatever. Things that basically have nothing to do with whether you're fit or not, or in prime shape. Okay, well, if so, if this is a possibility, but we know that possibility doesn't actually happen, well, maybe we can start to think of senescence as being adaptive. Maybe it's a naturally selected trait. Maybe it represents some kind of life history strategy, some kind of a trade-off. Okay. The most common theory for why it is that we age or senesce, this applies to humans as well as other organisms, is referred to as the disposable soma theory. We'll explain the words in just a minute, but the disposable soma theory is very much in line with life history trade-offs, and it basically runs like this. First of all, just to help us understand right now, soma is a technical word for the body, and it is intended to distinguish the cells in our body that are not reproductive, that are not basically associated with reproduction. There are cells that are not our gametes. So it's the rest of our body. That's what the word soma means. And this title suggests that our body is disposable. Well, how, or what does this mean? Here's the basic idea. Aging or senescence basically results from the accumulation of cellular damage that occurs during our lifetime. Aging has many, many manifestations. Wrinkled skin, arthritic joints, cancer. It goes on and on. Many, many different manifestations of aging, but they all basically are just different manifestations of damage occurring to our cells, and that damage just accumulates over time. What this disposable soma theory suggests is that there is a trade-off between somatic maintenance, a trade-off between maintaining the body and reproduction. So somatic maintenance is just a fancy word for repair. Repair right here, and of course we've seen this pie chart before. We're kind of representing these trade-offs between the four basic functions of any organism, and so basically the disposable soma theory says that there are important trade-offs between repairing our body over the course of our lifetime and reproduction, between these two ideas. And so the idea is that indeed maybe damage to our cells could be perfectly repaired throughout our lifetime, and if we were to study basically how it is that our cells work, in particular things like DNA replication, we know that there is energy that goes in to fixing mistakes in the replication process of DNA. When our DNA is replicated, it happens imperfectly, and there are cellular mechanisms that go through and try to find those mistakes and fix them. It turns out that in terms of the energy that it takes to do that repairing, it's really expensive in terms of energy. We don't feel it because it's just happening all the time without our knowing it, but a great deal of the food that we put into our mouth is turned into energy devoted to repairing our cells. And here's the thing, is if we put more energy into that, it would be real costly. We probably put in just enough energy into it to make our lives as long as they are and that sort of thing. And so just to reiterate one point that I already made, and to just to reiterate it as an example, certain kinds of cancer, which represent one kind of senescence, almost certainly are the result of inadequate repair that occurs when cellular damage is done. Basically, at some point, natural selection favors reproduction over living for a long, long time. Because if we put all this energy into repairing our system, indeed, we'd live for a very, very long time, and we would die in perfect condition, but there'd be no energy left over for reproduction. And so what happens is that, and so the theory goes, I should say, is that natural selection allows for mutations and damage, that mutations to our DNA, damage that occurs to our cells. It allows for that so that there's enough energy for reproduction, and it all comes at the cost of a shorter life. Okay. To change subjects just a little bit, senescence is of great interest because when we see humans senescing, we think, wow, that's affecting their quality of life. And we think, wouldn't it be great if we could discover some medical insights that would maybe help mitigate that or prevent that or something like that. And so as a result, a lot of senescence is really focused on studying humans. And actually, we thought for a very, very long time that only some mammals senesce. We didn't think that it was a very common phenomenon for a very, very long time, and that most organisms, certainly non-mammals, didn't seem to senesce, and then among mammals didn't seem to happen. But what we've learned recently is that there's hardly an organism that we've studied carefully that doesn't end up showing signs of senescence. Even unusual things, or things that you might not think of, like trees, mice that don't even live sometimes but for a couple of years, red squirrels that don't live very long, even things like insects, mosquitoes, even bacteria. All of these creatures, along with the others depicted here on this image, have all been shown to show signs of senescence. It's just that for some organisms it's a little harder to detect. But it's no less important, and it's certainly, it's there. It's just harder to find. I'd mentioned that arthritis and senescence in humans is of particular interest because it causes humans to suffer, and we look for ways to mitigate this in the biomedical field. I just offered for you an explanation for why it is that senescence occurs and why it is that arthritis occurs. That explanation represents an evolutionary explanation. There are other explanations for things like arthritis that are more of a physiological nature. They're not inconsistent with this natural selection or evolutionary explanation for things like arthritis. They're not inconsistent with those explanations, just different. And so these physiological explanations for arthritis, especially in humans, run something like this. There's been three ideas that have been kind of running around for some time. One is that injury may predispose a person for arthritis. And this may be an injury that you incur maybe in the prime of your life, and it's not until many years later that that injury becomes the site of arthritis. Another possibility is genetics. There's some thoughts that, well, if your parents are prone to arthritis, well, then the offspring of those parents may have a greater chance of having arthritis than, say, offspring of parents who didn't ever have arthritis. And so a lot of work has been kind of focused on figuring out, well, which of those two ideas, injury or genetics, is the more important, and, anyways, trying to figure that out. The other possibility is that stress may have something to do with it. A couple different kinds of stress, basically just things like psychological stress, and also, in particular, early nutritional stress. This idea that if you're malnourished as a youngster, that many, many years later, you'll be predisposed to getting arthritis. We know that there are other phenomena in a human's life that work like that. And we're really just kind of recently discovering these things. For example, in humans, the chance of getting heart disease or stroke is elevated when that person as a youngster wasn't as well nourished. Trying to figure out these connections between early nutritional stress and what happens late in life is pretty difficult business in humans. First of all, you can't do experiments. You can't intentionally malnourish some people and give other people good nourishment and see what happens later on. You can't do that, of course. The second thing that's not so convenient for humans is that we live for such a long time. So you'd have to follow people for maybe 50, 60, or 70 years in order to understand what's going on. And so what happens is that moose end up being a really interesting creature in order to study this phenomenon in, because first of all, moose don't live as long, so you can follow a moose from the beginning of its life to the end of its life in just a couple of decades rather than in, say, 5 or 6 decades. And the other thing is that you don't have to conduct an experiment on moose to malnourish some and give others better nourishment. It happens naturally. Some moose in any population are better nourished than others. And some of these malnourished moose are really quite severely malnourished. Some of them die because of it. Die as youngsters even. Some of them survive, but they just barely squeak through. And then others do reasonably well. And so what may be the case is we may be able to answer this question about early nutritional stress in humans and how it relates to arthritis. That's maybe our interest, but maybe we can use moose as a surrogate for humans and try to understand it there. And so the question is well, I've been talking about it already, does early nutritional stress predispose an organism to developing arthritis later in life? And here's how it is that we can use the moose to help us do this. We're going to use the metatarsus again. We already spoke about this bone in the previous lecture. Metatarsus again is this foot bone. That bone does all of its growing in the first year of life. The way that we know when the bone stops growing basically is that while it's growing, there's an epiphysis right here. An epiphysis is just a surface in a bone where growth takes place. So this bone basically starts off as two separate bones, and those two bones are, one is right here and then one is down here. And right at the joint between those two bones is a site of active growth, and that's how the length of that bone increases. When that joint is fused together, when the two bones become one, the bone stops growing in its length. So you can even look at the bone and tell whether it was done growing or not. That bone is fused in most moose by about 1 year of life. And so what happens is that the length of that bone is a permanent record of early nutritional conditions. And so we know this is our basic question about early nutritional stress and getting arthritis later in life. What we want to do is basically translate that question in something that applies to the moose, and basically here it is are moose with smaller metatarsal bones more likely to die with arthritis? That's the question for us. And so the data that we want to look at can be represented with this kind of a graph. And on the x-axis of the graph will be just metatarsal length. And so these would be the moose with the short metatarsal bones. They're the ones with that had malnourished periods during their early development. And then these moose with the long metatarsal bones, they're the ones that did well during their first year of life. Now this y-axis here is a little bit complicated. It's the percent increase in the odds. Now an odds, the definition of an odds is described up above. How much of this next little statistical detail you understand is okay. If you understand all of it just fine, that's wonderful. If you kind of just barely get it, that's not too big a deal. Just understand that if you're up here, let me clear this. If you're up here, you're more likely to have arthritis, and if you're down here, you're less likely to have arthritis. That's the main take-home message. If you want to know a little bit more about it, though, the definition of the odds is right there. It's P divided by 1 minus P, where P is the probability, in this case, of getting arthritis. I hate to say it, but if you're into betting on sporting events, you're already pretty familiar with odds, because when you bet on sporting events, say football games and stuff like that, it's usually there are 3-to-1 odds or 10-to-1 odds. That's how you determine well, how much you think you want to bet and how much money you'll get if you win the bet. Those numbers, 10-to-1, 3-to-1, those are the odds. 3-to-1 odds means you're 3 times more likely to win than lose in that context. And then the odds work something similar here. The next thing to understand is that the details of the statistics of how you do this analysis are, again, kind of complicated. It's mostly based on logistical regression, and if we're interested to talk about it in our discussion, we can do that. But for now, it's just a fancy form of regression. And the main thing to understand is the general expectation that we have is that if early nutritional stress is associated with a higher chance of having arthritis later in life, then the relationship we expect is generally a declining trend like this red line here. Here is the result. Okay, and the result we need to kind of describe a little bit. First of all, we can see right away the declining trend that we expect is the one that we find. So the Isle Royale moose indeed seem to suggest that if you're malnourished early in life, if you're these moose over here, then you have a higher chance of getting arthritis later in life. And if you were well-nourished early in life, then you are less likely to get arthritis. So you're down in the spot right here. Okay, now what I need to do, just to maybe help you out a little bit further, is describe to you what each one of these dots represent, because those dots are not the raw data; they're a little bit derived, and they're derived basically in this way. I can point out a couple of the dots first, and then all the rest will make sense. First, this dot right here represents the largest moose in our sample. They represent moose that are of the 90th percentile or bigger. And so those moose are kind of like the reference point. That's why they are over here at 0. So basically the rest of the graph is read in relationship to these biggest moose. Now these moose over here, up at the upper left-hand corner, these moose are the smallest moose in our sample. They are the 10th percentile or smaller. And so now all the other dots are the 20th percentile, 30th percentile, and so on. And so what happens is that, we can look at it this way. If we focus on those smallest moose, the 10th percentile, the interpretation to offer is that the smallest moose have about 2.9 times greater odds of getting arthritis than do the biggest moose on the island. And so that's why 2.9 is associated with about 290%. So anyways, those are a little bit of the details of how we follow that. If you didn't grasp all the statistical details, that's all right. If you're eager for more statistical details, we can do that in a lecture period. There's more to this arthritis story. And this is the last general point that I want to make about life history theory. There ends up being some very important connections between individual life histories and populations. Remember, these are two levels of organization that life manifests itself as. More generally, there's individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. Well, those first two levels, individuals and populations, they're connected in some really interesting ways, and this graph begins to show how. What this graph shows is that on the x-axis, that's the year of birth for a particular moose, and on the y-axis is the incidence of arthritis for moose when they die, given the year they're born in. So in other words, if you, just to pick one value here, if a moose was born in the year 1950, right here, then that moose, when it dies, maybe 10 years later, maybe 15 years later, there's about a 30% chance that that moose will have arthritis. Okay, well, we see obviously there's some kind of a trend that goes up and down again. Here's the main thing, is that the incidence of arthritis among these different cohorts of moose, it varies quite a bit, from as low as 20% chance of getting arthritis to as high as 80% chance of getting arthritis, depending on the year in which you're born. Well, there's some explanation for this. The explanation for it is that some years are tougher than others in terms of the environment, in terms of maybe the winter severity or how much food was available. And so in other words, if you were born in, say, just particular, the year 1960, a year that had moose that eventually died with a high incidence of arthritis, that was a tough year for one reason or another for most of those moose. So that's the explanation behind this pattern. But here's the important thing, and let's kind of look at it this way, is that there's this connection. This is the connection that I was speaking about between life history and population dynamics. Now what I'm showing you is a separate line here, right here, this in this dark blue. This shows the trend in the abundance of moose for those different years. And we see that there's some concordance between those two trajectories. In really abundant years, when moose were really abundant, those also tended to be years when the moose that were born eventually had a pretty good chance of dying with arthritis. Well, when moose are abundant, there's less food per moose in many cases, more competition among those moose, and then maybe those are the conditions under which things aren't so good for the youngsters, for the young moose. And so, again, there's this really important connection between life history and population dynamics, and we're starting to see it with this graph here. But it goes further and deeper, and here's a little bit about how. On the x-axis, we have the incidence of arthritis among moose that are killed by wolves, and then on the y-axis is the kill rate, measured in kilograms per wolf per day. And then each one of these dots represents a different year in the data set. And so just to, to interpret here, for one particular year right here, about 60% of the moose that wolves killed had arthritis. And in that particular year, the kill rate was relatively low, quite low in that particular example. What we see is that there's a significant declining trend. In fact, about 23% of the variation in kill rate is associated with this incidence of arthritis. If we recall from previous lectures where we focused on kill rate, to explain 23% of the variation in kill rate from one factor like arthritis, that's a big deal. But it's another unexpected result. It's a little bit counterintuitive at the very least. And again, so when arthritis is more common, that's when the kill rates were lower. At least superficially, that doesn't seem to quite make sense. I think what's going on, it's difficult to know for sure, is just basically a more complicated explanation. And I think the explanation might be this, is that when times are tough for wolves, that is, for example, when the kill rates are low, and when the average moose is in good condition, those would represent tough times for wolves, then the only way that wolves can get by is to find and kill arthritic moose. In those cases, they're the only kind of moose that are vulnerable to predation, and wolves just have to find them. And so that would explain why, when it is that kill rates are low, the incidence of arthritis among wolf-killed moose tends to be low. That's why we got, the regression line being in the lower right-hand corner for that part. The flip side of it is that when times are easy for the wolves, for example, when winters are severe, when there's a favorable age structure for the wolves, in other words, there's a lot of old moose around that are suffering from all kinds of things, sometimes arthritis, but sometimes jaw necrosis, sometimes they're just so old they're having a tough time getting around, getting food. So when there's a favorable age structure in that sense, favorable for the wolves, when times are easy in those cases, then wolves can kill all kinds of moose. They can kill the calves, they can kill non-arthritic moose that are suffering from other things, and in those cases, you would expect the kill rate to be high and the incidence of arthritis among wolf-killed moose to be relatively low, and that explains why the curve is going up here in this spot. It's a pretty elaborate explanation. But I think the point of that elaborate explanation is that the connections between life history theory and population dynamics can be pretty complicated and pretty nuanced. And that complexity and nuance, first of all, makes it difficult to kind of predict and expect what would happen. Because remember, we expected something quite opposite from this. Okay? But it does a little bit more than just make life kind of like difficult to predict and expect. Here's what's going on. And what I want to do here is I want to take a step back on this topic of life history population dynamics, and I want to make the most general point that I possibly can. It applies very much to moose, but it applies to really all organisms. And the point that I want to make involves three ideas. And the first idea is that senescence, while it comes in many different kinds, and we've mentioned some things, cancer, arthritis, jaw necrosis, osteoporosis, it goes on and on. While senescence manifests itself in a variety of ways, the ultimate manifestation is a decline in one of two age-specific vital rates. Here is one age-specific vital rate, and that age-specific vital rate is the survival rate. The chance of an individual moose surviving from 1 year to the next depends on how old it is. That's why it's an age-specific rate, and it's a vital rate because survival is one of the key properties of a population dynamics, one of the key vital rates. And what we see here is that, if you like, moose come in basically three kinds, and those three kinds are separated by these three areas on the graph. There would be calves, which have a little bit low survival rate. Then there would be these, what we can call prime-aged animals, for survival rate that's roughly between the ages of 2 and 12, where survival is just pretty darn high. And then there are these older moose where survival rate really is dropping off very, very quickly. And again, to just go through the graph in some detail, if you're a prime-aged moose, just pick a moose right over here, right around age 5, the chances that you'll survive from one year to the next, on average, are right about in this 90 or 95% chance of surviving. If you're whatever right here, about a 15-year-old moose, your chances of surviving from one year to the next, on average, are quite a bit lower, right around 55% or so. Okay, so basically, this is senescence. And it may occur for a wide range of reasons. Maybe it's because you have arthritis or because you have osteoporosis or whatever, but it ultimately gets manifest as that. The other basic manifestation of senescence, the other ultimate manifestation of senescence is through reproduction, age-specific reproduction. The chances of you reproducing in a particular year depends on how old you are. It's true for any organism. Moose illustrate this idea very well. We don't have data from Isle Royale for this case, so this is data from British Columbia. Of course, we know that calves don't reproduce at all, and then yearlings reproduce only a little bit, 2-year-olds quite a bit more, and then so on. Reproduction, well, we can have this graph here. Between about the ages of 3 and 11, reproduction is in its prime and peak condition, and then when you're younger than that, right in here, you haven't achieved that high reproductive output yet, and then when you're senescing, when you're declining, then the reproductive rates drop off dramatically. Okay, so senescence ultimately manifests itself as vital rates, and these are the two vital rates, survival and reproduction, that govern population dynamics. If you know what survival rate is and pregnancy rate, you can know whether the population is increasing or decreasing. And so what happens, and here's the second point, is that the age structure of a population fluctuates over time. And I want to illustrate that using Isle Royale data with a graph that I want to show you in little bits and pieces. So first of all, just to highlight a few basic parts of it, along the x-axis is time, going from the beginning of the study, 1959, up until relatively recent time periods, 2003. And then this is the proportion of the population right here. And I'm showing you at the moment just the first year so that we can kind of digest the graph in bits and pieces. The height of that bar represents all the moose that there are in the population. And then the 3 different colors represent these 3 different kinds of moose. The calves, the prime-aged animals, and then the senescent animals. So it has to add up to 100% because those are the only kind of moose that there are. Calves, prime-aged, and senescent. And what we see that in the year 1959, that calves represented, I don't know, that's maybe about 16% of the population. Senescent animals represented maybe, that's something about 7 or 8% of the population. The rest were prime-aged animals. Okay, well, that's one particular year. Here's the next year. Changed just a little bit. Calves are a little bit more abundant, so are older animals. Prime-aged animals are a little bit less abundant. That's going to be a slightly better situation for the wolves, mind you, because wolves prefer those calves and those senescent animals. Here's the next year. Changes just a little bit once again. Notice that senescent portion is getting bigger again 3 years in a row. Here's after 4 years. Again, the number of senescents getting bigger in proportion. That's going to be a good thing for the wolves. Here's another year once again, and here's the whole thing. Almost 50 years worth of data. And so the point is, number one, from the previous graph, if the age of the moose, I should say it differently. Point number one is that the vital rates of a population are going to depend on the age structure of that population. If you got a bunch of prime-aged animals, that population is going to be smoking. They're going to have high survival rates and high reproductive rates. If you have a bunch of 18-year-old moose comprising the entire population, that population is not going to do very good. Going to have low survival rate, low reproduction rate. And so what you can imagine, and it's in anticipation of the next slide, is that with these fluctuations over time, it's going to affect population dynamics. I'll show you that point. That's the third point. I'll show you that in just 1 minute. There is some important questions here. And that is why. Why does this fluctuate over time? And just like when we studied predation, and we asked what causes predation to fluctuate over time, we have the same kind of question we can ask here, and it's the same candidates for the answers. One possibility is that it could be the wolf population that is maybe doing things, and in particular, it would be it would start off as a small effect, but it would amplify into a big thing. This period right here where the calf production was relatively low, one possibility is that maybe wolves were responsible for that. Wolves like to eat calves. And if there were a lot of wolves in those years, and if they were predating at really high rates, and if they clobbered the calves, there wouldn't be very many of them. If there aren't very many calves today, that means 15, 20 years down the road, there won't be very many old animals in the population. So it's possible that wolves somehow shape this, and if they do, it would be through a very long time lag. Because basically the mode of operation would be what they do to the calves, and then it just kind of manifests itself over the next 10 to 20 years. The other possibility is that climate. Winter severity, once again, it would be especially manifest through the calves. That's where it probably all starts. Is that, again, just if we look at this period right here where there's low calf production, what if those were a series of severe winters, and calf survival was poor during those winters, and that's why the calf production proportion of calves in the population is low. So it could be climate, or it could be wolves, or of course some combination of the both. Those questions we haven't yet answered for the Isle Royale system. The data are there waiting for us to get around to it, and we'll hope to do it soon. But for the moment, just to kind of point out those questions. This is the second of the 3 points I want to make. Oh, and I'm sorry, one more small thing here. Because all of this business is fluctuating over time, the red line that I've just thrown up on this graph is red over on the right-hand side of the graph here. Okay, it's the mean age of the population. We see that because there's fluctuations in the amount of calves and the amount of senescent animals in the population, the average age of the moose population fluctuates, and it fluctuates a great deal. In some years, it's almost 8, and in other years, it's as low as 2.5 or 3 years old. So it can fluctuate quite a bit over time, the average age. And so this is the third point, and what this graph shows is how it is that the average age of the moose population, again ranging from about almost in the neighborhood of 3 years of age to 8, how that is associated with the annual population growth rate of the moose population. Again, I should have highlighted this here. This is the point of zero growth, that horizontal line right there. I'll erase it, but just so you can point out that, so I can point out that zero spot. So in other words, when the moose population is particularly old, it has a tendency to decline just because the moose are old. And when the moose population is particularly young, it has a tendency to increase just because most of the animals are young and in prime age and in prime condition. And in fact, quite a bit of the variation in growth from one year to the next for the moose population is explained by this 36% of the variation. And so, here are these 3 ideas coming together. First, the 2 ideas. We talked about stuff that is squarely within the realm of life history. That's the stuff that's highlighted in red. And then we talked about processes that are squarely rooted in population biology. And then this last point puts them together, because basically the x-axis of this third graph is, when we talk about age, it has a lot to do with life history. And then this vertical axis has a lot to do with population biology. This is where these 2 ideas come together. And here's kind of the big point of the whole thing. We already mentioned, and this is kind of the big overarching lesson about life history theory, really. First of all, not only is it interesting all by itself, and that's why we focused on it, of course, but organisms and populations are connected to one another. Now, there's a simple way in which they're connected, and that's just to say, well, that's kind of easy to understand. Populations are comprised of individuals, and individual life history is connected to population dynamics in some of the ways that I just showed you. Okay, that's fine, and that's kind of straightforward. But here's what goes a little bit further, and the last set of slides, I hope, demonstrates that in a clear enough manner, is that populations are not merely the sum of its parts. It's not merely just a bunch of individuals and then that's all there is to it, because if that's the case, you wouldn't actually need to study populations as a unique entity. You could just study individuals in great detail, and everything about a population would just kind of emerge from it quite naturally, and you'd be able to predict the behavior of populations just by looking at how organisms behave, and that would be all. But it's not the case. Populations are characterized by what we refer to as emergent properties, properties that cannot be inferred or guessed from how it is that the individuals behave. And that's why we have these hierarchical levels in the first place, because there's something special about populations that you can't figure out by studying organisms. Just the same, there's something special about communities that you can't figure out by studying only populations and kind of guessing how it will all get put together. And, well, why is this the case? Why is this the case especially at this level? Well, basically, it's because the individuals vary among themselves. They're not all doing the same thing. Not only do they vary among themselves, no two individuals being the same, but even any individual varies over its lifetime, for example, as it senesces, and it's basically that kind of complexity that is just simply makes it not possible to only study organisms and then figure out, oh, from that we'll figure out how the populations work. And so these connections between these hierarchical levels, that's where a lot of the magic is, I think, in how it is that, that life works and how it is that ecosystems work and that sort of thing. And so anyways, that concludes our discussion about life history theory as it applies to Isle Royale and the moose there and what we've learned about life history theory. The next topic that we're going to take in the next lecture is going to shift and focus on ecosystems, how it is that the wolves and moose of Isle Royale shape and alter and influence ecosystem processes, in particular the flow of energy and nutrients through the different parts of the ecosystem. It's pretty interesting stuff, and I look forward to sharing it with you in the next lecture. And in the meantime, thanks again for your attention here, and we'll see you, when we cover the lecture on ecosystems. Thanks, and bye now.